The Overcoat, 1842. Gogol was a strange creature, but genius is always strange. It is only your healthy second-rater who seems to the grateful reader to be a wise old friend, nicely developing the reader's own notions of life. Great literature skirts the irrational. Hamlet is the wild dream of a neurotic scholar. Gogol's The Overcoat is a grotesque and grim nightmare making black holes in the dim pattern of life. The superficial reader of that story will merely see in it the heavy frolics of an extravagant buffoon. The solemn reader will take for granted that Gogol's prime intention was to denounce the horrors of Russian bureaucracy. But neither the person who wants a good laugh nor the person who craves for books that make one think will understand what The Overcoat is really about. Give me the creative reader. This is a tale for him. Steady Pushkin, matter-of-fact Tolstoy, restrained Chekhov have all had their moments of irrational insight which simultaneously blurred the sentence and disclosed a secret meaning worth the sudden focal shift. But with Gogol, this shifting is the very basis of his art, so that whenever he tried to write in the round hand of literary tradition and to treat rational ideas in a logical way, he lost all trace of talent. When, as in his immortal The Overcoat, he really let himself go and pottered happily on the brink of his private abyss, he became the greatest artist that Russia has yet produced. The sudden slanting of the rational plane of life may be accomplished, of course, in many ways, and every great writer has his own method. With Gogol, it was a combination of two movements, a jerk and a glide. Imagine a trapdoor that opens under your feet with absurd suddenness, and a lyrical gust that sweeps you up and then lets you fall with a bump into the next trap hole. The absurd was Gogol's favorite muse, but when I say the absurd, I do not mean the quaint or the comic. The absurd has as many shades and degrees as the tragic has, and moreover, in Gogol's case, it borders upon the latter. It would be wrong to assert that Gogol placed his characters in absurd situations. You cannot place a man in an absurd situation if the whole world he lives in is absurd. You cannot do this if you mean by absurd something provoking a chuckle or a shrug. But if you mean the pathetic, the human condition, if you mean all such things that in less weird worlds are linked up with the loftiest aspirations, the deepest sufferings, the strongest passions, then of course the necessary breach is there, and a pathetic human lost in the midst of Gogol's nightmarish, irresponsible world would be absurd by a kind of secondary contrast. On the lid of the tailor's snuff box there was the portrait of a general. I do not know what general, because the tailor's thumb had made a hole in the general's face and a square of paper had been gummed over the hole. Thus with the absurdity of Akaky Akakievich Basmachkin. We did not expect that amid the whirling masks, one mask would turn out to be a real face, or at least the place where that face ought to be. The essence of mankind is irrationally derived from the chaos of fakes which form Gogol's world. Akaky Akakievich, the hero of The Overcoat, is absurd because he is pathetic. Because he is human, and because he has engendered by those very forces which seem to be in such contrast to him. Because he is human, and because he has been engendered by those very forces which seem to be in such contrast to him. He is not merely human and pathetic, he is something more, just as the background is not mere burlesque. Somewhere behind the obvious contrast there is a subtle genetic link. His being discloses the same quiver and shimmer as does the dream world to which he belongs. The allusions to something else behind the crudely painted screens are so artistically combined with the superficial texture of the narration that civic-minded Russians have missed them completely. But a creative reading of Gogol's story reveals that here and there in the most innocent descriptive passage, this or that word, sometimes a mere adverb or a preposition, for instance the word even or almost, is inserted in such a way as to make the harmless sentence explode in a wild display of nightmare fireworks. Or else the passage that had started in a rambling, colloquial manner all of a sudden leaves the tracks and swerves into the irrational where it really belongs. Or again, quite as suddenly, a door bursts open and a mighty wave of foaming poetry rushes in, only to dissolve in bathos, or to turn into its own parody, or to be checked by the sentence breaking and reverting to a conjurer's patter. That patter which is such a feature of Gogol's style. It gives one the sensation of something ludicrous and at the same time stellar. lurking constantly around the corner. And one likes to recall that the difference between the comic side of things and their cosmic side depends upon one's sibilant. So what is that queer world, glimpses of which we keep catching through the gaps of the harmless-looking sentences? It is in a way the real one, but it looks wildly absurd to us, accustomed as we are to the stage setting that screens it. It is from these glimpses that the main character of The Overcoat, the meek little clerk, is formed, so that he embodies the spirit of that secret but real world which breaks through Gogol's style. He is, that meek little clerk, a ghost, a visitor from some tragic depths who by chance happened to assume the disguise of a petty official. Russian progressive critics sensed in him the image of the underdog, and the whole story impressed them as a social protest. But it is something much more than that. The gaps and black holes in the texture of Gogol's style imply flaws in the texture of life itself. Something is very wrong, and all men are mild lunatics engaged in pursuits that seem to them very important, while an absurdly logical force keeps them at their futile jobs. This is the real message of the story. In this world of utter futility, of futile humility and futile domination, the highest degree that passion, desire, creative urge can attain is a new cloak which both tailors and customers adore on their knees. I am not speaking of the moral point or the moral lesson. There can be no moral lesson in such a world because there are no pupils and no teachers. This world is, and it excludes everything that might destroy it. So that any improvement, any struggle, any moral purpose or endeavor are as utterly impossible as changing the course of a star. It is Gogol's world, and as such wholly different from Tolstoy's world or Pushkin's or Chekhov's or my own. But after reading Gogol, one's eyes may become Gogolized, and one is apt to see bits of his world in the most unexpected places. I have visited many countries, and something like Akakievich's Overcoat has been the passionate dream of this or that chance acquaintance who never had heard about Gogol. The plot of The Overcoat The Overcoat is very simple. A poor little clerk makes a great decision and orders a new overcoat. The coat, while in the making, becomes the dream of his life. On the very first night that he wears it, he is robbed of it on a dark street. He dies of grief, and his ghost haunts the city. This is all in the way of plot, but of course the real plot, as always with Gogol, lies in the style and the inner structure of this transcendental anecdote. In order to appreciate it at its true worth, one must perform a kind of mental somersault so as to get rid of conventional values in literature and follow the author along the dream road of his superhuman imagination. Gogol's world is somewhat related to such conceptions of modern physics as the concertina universe or the explosion universe. It is far removed from the comfortably revolving clockwork worlds of the last century. There is a curvature in literary style as there is curvature in space, but few are the Russian readers who do care to plunge into Gogol's magic chaos head first. But few are the Russian readers who do care to plunge into Gogol's magic chaos head first with no restraint or regret. The Russian who thinks Turgenev was a great writer and bases his notion of Pushkin upon Tchaikovsky's vile libretti will merely paddle into the gentlest wavelets of Gogol's mysterious sea and limit his reaction to an enjoyment of what he takes to be whimsical humor and colorful quips. But the diver, the seeker for black pearls, the man who prefers the monsters of the deep to the sunshades on the beach, will find in the overcoat shadows linking our state of existence to those of other states and modes which we dimly apprehend in our rare moments of irrational perception. The prose of Pushkin is three-dimensional. That of Gogol is four-dimensional at least. He may be compared to his contemporary, the mathematician Lobachevsky, who blasted Euclid and discovered a century ago many of the theories which Einstein later developed. If parallel lines do not meet, it is not because meet they cannot, but because they have other things to do. Gogol's art, as disclosed in the Overcoat, suggests that parallel lines not only may meet, but that they can wriggle and get most extravagantly entangled. Just as two pillars reflected in water indulge in the most wobbly contortions if the necessary ripple is there. Gogol's genius is exactly that ripple. 2 and 2 make 5, if not the square root of 5, and it all happens quite naturally in Gogol's world, where neither rational mathematics nor indeed any of our pseudo-physical agreements with ourselves can be seriously said to exist.